Okay, I think we're live, Maryam. Shall we make a start? Welcome, everybody. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the new series of Bread and Roses. I'm Maryam Namazie, and with my colleague Fariborz Pooya, we're going to be discussing the upcoming so-called Iranian elections. That's tomorrow. And so we wanted to have a program on this issue to raise some of the important questions that have arisen from this so-called election. And if it's okay with you, Fariborz, I'll just start.
Please do, yeah.
Obviously, you know, if we just look at the question of the so-called elections in Iran, it's very clear that these are not elections, because elections in the general sense of the term, it means that you have people who are free to be candidates in the election. In Iran, for example, you can only be a Muslim male, and only one that is approved by the supreme spiritual leader and by the guardian councils. So, you know, that in and of itself shows that it's discriminatory, unfair. And then, of course, you've got to have free expression, you've got to have free press, you've got to have free judiciary in case there's fraud or any other issues, so that it can be investigated. You've got to have freedom of assembly, freedom to protest. All of these things make it very clear that there is no such thing as a real election in Iran. Plus, if you look at the issue that this is a theocratic government, it is a totalitarian government. To call a government that is for God and by the representatives of God as something that has anything to do with people's will is absurd. You cannot have people's vote having any meaning when you are dealing with a theocracy and a dictatorship. And therefore, it's very right that people in Iran will say no to the elections, that they're boycotting it, that they're saying that their vote is for the overthrow of the regime. They're not going to vote for this regime, rightly so.
Yeah, I think the reality of the last 40 odd years of the Islamic regime has been lack of any accountability, lack of any popular participation in decision making in Iran. Majority of power centers of power is decided by the supreme leader. You've never seen him in front of a group of people to be accountable. No, you've never seen him in front of journalists, even their own journalists, to answer the questions. And none of them are accountable to anything. Even when they elect their own president, they have limited ability to do anything. The president of Islamic Republic in Iran, and most of the elections, they have to go through Islamic Guardian Council. So anybody who wants to stand in those elections has to be vetted and confirmed as somebody who believes in the Islamic Republic, pays allegiance to the supreme leader. And even then, a former president of Iran, for example, he's never passed because he's got a slight disagreement. Their own friends are not allowed. So popular voice and general population, they don't have any means by which to express themselves. So it has to be outside of the Islamic sort of government system of supposed elections. So this election is complete farce. That's the first point. However, and I think they need a legitimacy. They need to show every 4 years that they have some sort of they put on the show. In the past, what they have done, they've always created two sections and two factions, and they've tried to do two sets of puppets, right wing and moderate or reformist. In reality, no such thing has existed in Iran. It's all been a show. This round, because of the pressure that the popular movement in Iran has put on the Islamic regime, only limited number of people have actually been vetted to stand for elections. Mm-hmm. And the reason is that there's been huge mass strikes in Iran. For example, Haftap sugar cane factory, huge years of a strike to end privatization and corruption. There's huge corruption in the banking system. There's huge unemployment. There's inflation going through the roof. The prisons in Iran are full of the atheists and people who disagree with the Islamic regime of Iran. They can't stop people, despite the fact that they've actually had huge amount of executions, public executions. Protests in Iran have been banned effectively. People are actually surrounding the Islamic regime of Iran and turning this election against them. It's very clear that majority of people are not going to participate in the farce. Election that is a reality, a farce. And the pressure is so much on the Islamic regime. They're surrounded by people of Iran, and that's why they put them in a really, really difficult situation, despite the fact that the Islamic regime of Iran enjoys, and let me say this clearly, enjoys the support of the Western countries, Russia and China. They are using the nuclear negotiations to maintain the Islamic regime. They never talk about the popular opposition to the Islamic regime election. It's not a boycott. People are not participating and actually actively trying to turn the election against the Islamic regime of Iran as a vote of no confidence. Islamic regime try to encourage the fact that they're very worried of the fact that not many people are going to participate in the election. So they try to set up these podiums on different streets in different cities for people to come and express their view and support the regime. What's happened in every single podium that I've set up in different cities, people have actually, they've taken on microphones and they started demanding the fact that Islamic regime should go. And they're very clearly, very bravely, people are saying, "Oh, we don't want the Islamic regime of Iran. We don't want. We will not be participating in election. There is no such thing as reformists and the conservative right wing and left wing in the Islamic regime. They're all the same. They're a bunch of criminals who have taken over power." And very clearly the voice is coming. Unfortunately, I'm not sure if that sort of reality is expressed in the media in Western countries or in the international media. And I think that's something
I think your voice.
Am I back
again? Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, that's an important point, isn't it? Because the Observer, for example, just the other day had an editorial saying that the elections were rigged. The reality is that the elections have been rigged for 40 plus years. That is the reality. There is no elections in Iran. It's a farce to call it that. And I've already explained why that's the case. So it's always been rigged in favor of the Islamic Republic and against the people. The very fact that only candidates approved by the Supreme Leader and the Guardian Council can even run is one. The other is the fact that even though they speak of different factions in Iran, the so-called reformist faction and the conservative faction, in the presidency of both of these factions, there have been massive human rights violations. Khatami and Rouhani were hailed as reformers. However, we know very clearly that in the real world, reform has meaning. It means changes in the law, in public policy, in the society, in favor of the public. No such thing has happened. Some of the major killings and human rights violations have taken place under the leadership of the reformers. So clearly, these are games that the Islamic Republic has played, and sometimes, people have fallen for these games in the sense of voting for example, the reformist faction, partly because it was a vote between bad and worse. And I think what's different this time is that it's become very clear to a large majority of people in Iran, at least vocally, very vocally, it's become clear. People are vocally expressing very clearly their opposition to both factions, and the fact that they are a bunch of criminals that have held Iranian society hostage for over 40 years. And so people are very publicly, even though many are facing arrests right after they speak in these public podiums, and you've got mothers of those who've been killed during various phases of the Islamic Republic of Iran's killings, being arrested, being beaten, being harassed. Nonetheless, they're saying that, we will continue to speak and we will not vote for this government. Now, you've got some Western media saying that the people of Iran are being apathetic. They're showing apathy. They're not voting. It's not apathy. It's resistance. It's rebellion. You cannot vote for a totalitarian state. You cannot vote for a dictatorship. It's like saying, let's not fight against Nazi Germany. Let's vote them out. It doesn't work that way when you are dealing with a dictatorship of this form. And so it's very clearly an important resistance, and one that needs to be supported by people everywhere.
Yeah, and I think Ayan is asking what happens if people don't show up in the vote in Iran. Well, the first thing is that the couple of aspects of this. It's first of all, the Islamic regime of Iran has never been legitimate. However, psychologically, in the movement to get rid of the Islamic regime in Iran, it has a major impact. It opens a new phase in the battle between the Iranian people and the Islamic regime of Iran. So that's the first thing. People are not only not showing up for elections, but actively opposing and being vocal against the corruption, lack of accountability, the fact that there's huge inflation and economic stagnation in Iran, huge unemployment, child labor, women's rights, freedom of expression and political prisoners. These are not just theoretical items on somebody's sort of manifesto. These are live debates in Iranian society. Every day, families of political prisoners are around different prisons in Iran, and they're extremely active on social media and putting pressure on the Islamic regime to release the loved ones. Every day there are strikes in Iran, not only opposing privatization, but demanding the wages. It's just staggering the volume of the strikes and protests in the labor movement in Iran. They don't want to talk about women's movement in Iran because it's so clearly, and it's great to see that's been recognized internationally as a major bastion of opposition to the Islamic regime of Iran. So you have the political prisoners, you have the women's movement, you have the labor movement. Now you have all of that, people who are seeking justice for mothers who've lost the children or the families. They're seeking justice against the Islamic regime, the campaign against execution, for example, in Iran. All of that, and against corruption, major issue in Iran. All of that, it's put the Islamic regime in a corner, as if they're surrounded. They are isolated in their own little castle. They're surrounded by popular movements. And the fact that this election is coming to a head, it's a moment that the confidence of the popular movement is back. We expect major changes in the balance of force between the popular movement and the Islamic regime. Look out for huge change and continuation of these protests. So it's a moment. So it's not apathy, it's not lack of interest in politics, it's actually active movement to get rid of the Islamic regime. So the three slogans: no more votes. That's one of the slogans currently. No to Islamic regime of Iran and in its totality. And the fact that we're not participating in this election, it's a farce. It's a circus. It's not an election. That's the very clear a message that Iranian people are giving, and I think it's important that we portray the reality of that struggle and battle and resistance in Iran, which is moving into a new phase. Maryam.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is particularly, you know, we live in a world now of social media. We live in a world where there are citizen journalists and people are speaking directly to the public in a way that has never been the case. And I think that's why we are seeing the voices of so many of the families of those who've lost loved ones at various protests in the prisons of the Iranian regime over many, many decades. And, you know, their voices are coming out very strong. The voices of civil society is coming out strong. And, you know, worker activists, labor activists, women's rights activists, environmentalists, you know, children's rights activists, these are all people who are speaking up now face to face to the public and clearly explaining why they are not going to vote for the government anymore. They are criminals that are candidates. They are not worthy of anyone's vote. And you know, I think, in a sense, even though the elections have been like this for the past 40 years, what's changed is that we're seeing the you know, the disillusionment, the hate, the opposition against this regime, and how it's antithetical to the people of Iran and their demands and desires for a different life, which they deserve. And I think it is going to become more and more difficult for those who are trying to continue to give legitimacy to this government. It's becoming more and more difficult because you know, you do have sections that talk about how the Islamic Republic of Iran came to power on the back of a people's revolution, and therefore it has legitimacy. This is people's culture, it's their religion, this is what they want. And I think clearly we know, first of all, that the Iranian Revolution was not an Islamic revolution to start with. Victors write history, and that's what's happened. But also that it is legitimate. And I think because of social media, because of people now speaking up to an extent that we've never seen before, really, that it's becoming very clear that this government has no legitimacy. Really, those in power should be tried in some court because of their crimes against humanity, rather than being, you know, elected into any government.
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize that those who actually gone through the expediency council, I suppose, is that the council that vets the candidates. Mm-hmm. Those, all 7 of those, chosen to stand and offered as bananas. People say we don't want bananas, we want oranges. Anyhow, to stand in elections, all of them have criminal records. One of them was a member of the death group in the 80s, early 80s, who actually gave order for execution of prisoners. Even they say, if you find them half alive, don't have mercy, kill them all. And these are the people who actually are standing for election. So one of the issues were even debating within the ranks of the Islamic regime, what happens if Raisi, one of the candidates, becomes a president and gets elected? If he goes abroad, he'll get arrested because a huge violation of human rights and against him. There's so many cases that he's been in charge. He's currently head of judiciary in Iran, responsible for many murders, and he'll get arrested. These are the type of people that we're dealing with. So none of these people who've actually stood for election or passed through the election vetting system have any legitimacy. They're all criminals. But that's not the issue. The Islamic regime of Iran and people who stood for elections always had those characteristics. What is different this time is that people are surrounding them. The election, they've turned it into a battleground against the Islamic regime. and are depriving the Islamic regime of even this farcical election, so-called elections, as a means by which for them to pretend they have an iota of legitimacy on the international scene. I think that's the important part, and we need to make sure that everybody recognizes that the movement or the lack of participation is a really active movement in Iran against the Islamic regime, and the end result is that people don't want the Islamic regime. 95% of Iranian population do not want the Islamic regime. Only a handful who are benefiting from, and a bunch of criminals, to be frank, or they are linked, or they're benefiting from an Islamic theocracy who is turning life of millions of people in Iran and Middle East into misery.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the main points is that even if tomorrow, next week, the Iranian regime says that they've had 80%, of the population that's allowed to vote, actually voting, the point of the matter is that they're not going to be believed anymore. And they have, I think, to a large extent, lost complete legitimacy. I mean, they've always been illegitimate in our eyes, in the eyes of people in Iran. But the reality is that they have had some form of legitimacy in some circles, especially those who see, in various circles, those who see Islamist movements as revolutionary movements, for example, which we know is nonsense. They're actually anti-revolutionary, regressive forces, for sure, rather than having any revolutionary characteristics. There are, of course, also Western governments, as you mentioned earlier, who have continued to support the Islamic regime, as they have the Saudi government, for example, because money talks, profit comes first, and the more repressive a government, the more money can be made. And I think there is any sort of opening as well. This move for the sort of this move to open Iran to Western companies and so on and so forth. Again, it will be in line with that sort of thinking that profit comes first, not human rights. And we've seen that throughout. Human rights is a real concern to Western governments as well. And I think that's why it's so key for people, good people everywhere, to support people in Iran. I think Ayan asked, what are the chances that the Iranian government will be toppled? Well, the reality is that there's no guarantees in any situation. It is a struggle, and it's important for us each to decide where we're going to stand in this struggle. Are we going to stand with forces of reaction or with forces for human progress? And I think it's very clear that those who stand with the Iranian regime, because also they might think it's an anti-imperialist government, again, not true, and it is an imperialist state in and of itself, especially in the region. If you look at what it's doing in Iraq, in Syria, and in other places, and of course its links to terrorism, its links to massive human rights violations over the past 40 years, it has no legitimacy, and it shouldn't. And I think what's changed now is that I think for a lot of people, that's going to become even clearer. I think it's kind of like when we had, the unveiling movement in Iran, women challenged compulsory veiling rules, and it was more difficult for people to say that veiling is a right and a choice for women in Iran when you could see all this opposition. And I think, again, with these elections and this mass boycott and this call for an end to the regime and its illegitimacy, it will help to change how this regime is viewed.
I think it's important to, from my experience of last 40 odd years, being in opposition to the Islamic regime of Iran, I've never seen the confidence of the opposition. Thanks, Ayan. In opposition to Islamic regime of Iran, never seen so much confidence. I've never seen so much opposition openly in Iran. Look, they've had open mics. The Islamic regime tried to have open mics in different cities as a means by which to bring people to vote because they were worried that nobody's going to participate. Even those open mics have been turned into against the Islamic regime, and people are actually surrounded and actually demanding everyday issues. So I think it's a major confidence boost to people who want to get rid of Islamic regime in Iran. It actually shows the depth of opposition to the Islamic regime, and it shows how confident people are. People are not afraid anymore, despite the oppressiveness of the Islamic regime. So this is great. I think it's a really welcoming development in Iran. Tomorrow is the election day, supposedly. In many cities in the world, opposition groups have organized demonstration in front of the Iranian embassies where supposedly the voting will take place. I think it's an exciting time for resistance movement in Iran against the Islamic regime, and we welcome all the support of people who want a better future for people in Iran and Middle East, and to remove the threat of Islamic terrorism. I think we've always said you can only defeat the Islamic terrorism globally if the Islamic regime is overthrown by progressive forces. I think that's a amazing development that will change the face of Middle East, and I think this significant movement to oppose the Islamic regime's election farce, it's an amazing moment. So we welcome that. So hopefully we'll continue this. This is not going to go away. It's going to continue, and Bread and Roses will be here every week, hopefully, to support that movement and have that conversation with yourselves.
Yes. So thank you for joining us. We have had some other questions. One is about why Iranian women who are more educated than their male counterparts are not able to influence the election. I think what's clear is that, I guess the point we're making, and the point of the protests in Iran, is that you cannot influence the elections because they are not real elections. They are absurdities. They are a circus, because you cannot have elections in a totalitarian state. And so what we're seeing with this movement pushing against the Islamic Republic of Iran and saying we're not going to vote, and saying our vote is an end to this regime, that is how people, women, men, are influencing the situation in Iran. And I think that's a movement that we need to support. We need to look to. It can have huge repercussions in the situation across the globe. As we know, when the Iranian Revolution was co-opted and was suppressed by an Islamic movement in the 79-80, we saw its effects throughout the world, and the rise of Islamism, and the rise of Sharia law in countries that didn't have it prior to that. So clearly a sort of secular modern protest movement, as we're witnessing in Iran today, that's come to the fore at great risk, will have positive repercussions for not just Iran and the region, but the entire world. And so it's something that needs to be supported. And we urge all of you to support the protests against the so-called elections tomorrow on social media, if you can, in front of embassies of the Islamic Republic of Iran in the cities that you live in. Where speaking to your friends, to your neighbors, get people to see this widespread progressive movement and to support it. we thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you again at the same time next week. Until then, have a great week. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Take it.